Good morning, everyone. Happy Monday morning. I am so glad you have joined us this morning. Let me get over here to the chat so I can see who's here right now. And I am so excited that you're here with us today because I can't wait to introduce our guest who you see on the screen with you right now, Steve Spray. Steve is a hospice chaplain and a grief share facilitator. And I have been through Grief Share at least once, and I'm going through it again a second time with a friend of mine. It is so helpful when you are suffering loss. And that's the reason I wanted to have Steve on today so that he could tell you all about it. Steve, welcome to the chat session.
Good to be here, Nina.
And I know you're all wondering where Rodney is. I'm not sure. But I'm sure, hopefully, he was a little late last week getting on. Sometimes he has technical difficulties, and I'm hoping that he'll be here with us soon. But until he is, we're just going to go ahead and have a conversation with Steve. And Steve, I've got the ability to put some of the comments up here, so I just want to let you know that you've already got a good morning from one of our viewers. And we've got Lucas here. Lucas, I haven't seen you here before, so welcome to you. I'm glad you're here with us. And Carrie, good morning to you. So, Steve, tell me, how did you end up being a hospice chaplain?
Well,
I don't think I just want to say I don't think when you're when you're growing up, I don't think most people say in high school or college, gee, someday I want to be a hospice chaplain. So how did that come about for you?
well, you're right about that. Nobody wants to be a part of death and dying, and
Mhm.
so as many of us who come to Christ, we understand that God gives us gifts and abilities and a calling with that. And I asked Christ into my heart and life before my junior year in high school. Later on, I went to Tennessee Temple College and prepared for the ministry. And I was really going into music and didn't have quite the background to pursue that. And so I changed to music education. And the first half of my ministry was more so of working as an assistant pastor in the area of music and youth, and then tied into Christian schools where I would have graded choirs. But when I began to understand spiritual gifts, this is something that you don't ask for. It's what God gives you in your
Mm.
Christian life. And when you tap into it, there's a fulfillment there. And so I realized after going through the test that they have you to go through, that I had the gift of mercy, and that can work both good and bad, as you understand. But I understood that I had mercy, and so again, most of my first half of my life was in churches, working in the area of assistant pastorate, and connected with Christian schools. And so I came back to Huntsville in 1998, and I was trying to get a position with a local hospital here, Crestwood Hospital, as a chaplain there. They had never had a chaplain. And so over the next 2.5 years, I went through multiple interviews and just kind of worked at the hospital, doing different things there. And they never seemed to get that position settled. And so I had my knee scoped out. And when I came back, I lost my job there. And so I was out without any work for about 5 months. And so a nurse that went to my church approached me and said, Steve, have you ever thought about being a hospice chaplain? And I answered her by the fact that no, I don't think I would like to work with death and dying. It's kind of depressing. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that God had been preparing me all this time for this position. And all through my ministry, I began to realize that different times and places He had placed me, especially with senior care. And even at Crestwood Hospital, I had the opportunity to work with a cancer clinic, and not in a medical part, but more in engaging with those who were having treatment. and I had such a burden for those who had been given the sentence of death. And so
Mhm.
in May of 2000, the Lord allowed me to start in that position of hospice chaplain. And so this May, it'll be 24 years that I have been hospice chaplain.
Wow. Wow. That's an amazing story to me. And I'm curious, you said God had given you the gift of mercy, which I can see in you. That is evident in you. But I also believe that when God gives us certain gifts, they may be there already, but God develops them by taking us through things where we appreciate the need for those gifts. So if you have
Absolutely.
the gift of mercy, I suspect you've been through some things where you appreciated having mercy.
Well, Lord, again, life is can be difficult at times, and
Mhm,
sometimes things happen that you don't ask for, you don't want, but there you are. And I do
mhm,
think that it's important to know, how you're going to respond when life gives you something that you didn't anticipate. And so for me, it was really the second year that I was in this ministry of chaplaincy that my first wife walked away from me. And
mhm,
ultimately, it ended in a divorce. And so uh, that is a part of grief. Anytime you have a loss, there's grief involved, and sometimes we don't understand that. But there are different categories of grief, and death is just one of those categories. But it was literally when I was doing a grief support with a gentleman that I realized that I myself was in the middle of grief. This was like the second year
mhm,
of this
mhm,
position, and it was then that I realized that, Lord, I can't do this without your help. And
mhm,
as the scripture says, we come boldly before his throne of grace that we can receive mercy and grace to help us in our time of need. And it was
mhm,
at that time that I realized that it wasn't just a position, but it was more of a relationship with the Lord, with Christ, getting into the Word of God. And literally through my adversity, it drove me to get into God's Word, where I literally for 2 years
mhm,
lived in the Psalms as I absorbed
mhm,
the character of God and saw how He's faithful and how He's there for us in every aspect of our life. And it also drove me to prayer, genuine prayer,
mhm,
not just trying to impress the Lord with the procedure of prayer, but literally crying out to Him and understanding that He gives us what we need when we need it. And so those were very difficult, but they're very precious years. If you've ever gone through any form of grief in your life, you realize that when you're in the middle of grief, all you can do is hold on to the Lord. But it's when you come
mhm,
out of that grief that you have a story to tell, and it's his story that he is
mhm,
writing in your life, and
mhm.
he's still writing those chapters in your life.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I have to I'm so intrigued by what you just said about camping out in the Psalms. And I don't even know whether you chose that deliberately or God just kept bringing you to the Psalms. I suspect it was that, right?
Well,
Um,
I had actually had a my pianist at the time at the church I was working at. She had gone through something similar to what I was going through, and I asked her. I said, How did you deal with it? How did you make it through those difficult times?" And she said, "Steve, I lived in the Psalms." And so
mhm,
literally, and I have a procedure that I do where I read. There are 150 psalms, and so every day I take that and I go 30 chapters, and there's about 5 psalms I read every day. And so by doing that, you literally go through the psalm every month.
mhm,
And then I would do it the second month and the third month, and it ended up 2 years. Now I had other
mhm,
variations of devotions that I used, but that became my mainstay. That was my source.
mhm,
And even though I would go through it every month, God was teaching me something, and I would underline passages that God spoke to my heart about. And it wasn't about just reading a large amounts of scripture, but it was reading the word till my heart was touched. And
Mhm. Mhm.
sometimes, I may only got 2 or 3 psalms in, but it was when God was speaking to my heart, and I really felt like I was meeting with him.
Mhm. Yeah, I can completely understand that because actually, Steve, what you just described is the same routine that I had many years ago, back in the 1980s, when my 3-year-old son passed away,
Mm,
and I was going through grief. And actually, for me, I didn't even know where to begin. I just knew that somebody had given me this little formula for reading through the Psalms, which I thought would be a good thing to do. So, for our viewers, I want to give that to you in case you haven't heard of it before. This is basically how it works. On the first day of the month, so let's say you started this month coming up, it'd be March 1st. So on March 1st, you would read Psalm 1, and then you count forward 30 and read Psalm 31, 61, 91, and just keep counting forward 30, reading all of those on that day. And then the next day, on the second, you would read Psalm 2, Psalm 32, 62, 92, and so on, except for Psalm
Psalm 119.
119.
Yes,
Because when you get to that one, it is just so long. So it needs a day all to itself. And you do that every month that has a 31st
that's
of the
right.
month. That's when you read Psalm 19 is on the 31st of that month. And then the next month you start over again.
That's right.
And Steve, in my Bible, that is the most marked up book because every time I read, and no matter how many times I read those Psalms, every time I read in them, new things pop out at me that I didn't notice before. And sometimes I'd even find myself thinking, wait, what? I've read this a million times. I don't remember that being in there. I
Right.
know, I know I would have seen that before, but yeah, it's been there the whole time. And God just has his way of speaking to us individually and clearly and specifically
Right.
for the needs of the moment, I think, through the Psalms. So I want to ask you, do you have a particular psalm or a particular passage that is most meaningful to you?
Uh, I mean, all the Psalms are rich, and there's some
Mhm,
that, maybe pertain more to Israel, uh, and to that time period, but you see God's hand, you see his character in the Psalms. And the beauty of the Psalms is that there's a transparency as the writer is writing that they unashamedly share their feelings, whether it's frustration, anger,
mhm,
sadness, all that, and they're just real, they're genuine. And but then
mhm,
at the end of each psalm, and not every psalm, but most of the psalms, he comes right back to the beginning that God, you're still sovereign, you're still
mhm,
good, you're still
mhm,
faithful, and all the character qualities, because life changes for us all the time. And so one of the things I share with my patients and their families is that because life is always changing, we have to hold on to the things that never change. And so God's
mhm,
character never changes. The Bible says that Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And the Word of God is the same and is as relevant today as it was when it was first written. And so
mhm,
all these Psalms are very rich and special. Uh, and so it's hard to say because sometimes um, you go to a certain psalm when you're facing a different situation in your life, and you can glean from it. Uh, and so again, as you go through the psalms, I think God begins to speak to your heart, and then as you begin to meditate on those precepts, then they become ingrained, not just in your head, but now they're in your heart, and you begin to live those out. And then you begin to see God in a whole different light. And as He is helping you through your different struggles of life, then you're able to share with others. This is what
Right.
God can do for you. This is who He is,
Mhm.
and I know this because I've experienced Him.
Mhm. Absolutely. Absolutely. Steve, you mentioned before, I want to go back to this. You mentioned before that um, there are different, not levels of grief, but different types of grief, I guess. What we're grieving over might be different, but they're all still grief. So, and obviously, you mentioned one, the loss of a loved one, and that might be through death or through them leaving or not wanting to have anything to do with us anymore or something like that. And you experienced that. I think I've heard your story before. It was not just your wife, it was also one of your
No, it was
children.
daughter. Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. Yeah. So I can only imagine the depth of your grief at that time. Um, but we tend to think of grief as being only associated with death or maybe with the loss of a loved one in that manner. Or, for parents whose children are missing or something like that, we can understand that grief. But what are some of the others, particularly those ones that maybe we think to ourselves, oh, well, I shouldn't be grieving over this. In the
Well,
whole scheme of things, this shouldn't be that big of a deal. And yet it
well,
is.
right. Well, grief is literally it's a loss in your life. Any kind of a loss, whether it's a financial loss, a relationship loss, and so many times we go through financial hardships, and we lose the opportunity to financially take care of our family, and so there's
Mhm,
grief there. Um, Sometimes as our children grow older and they move out, there's grief there. We
mhm,
used to call it the empty nest syndrome. And
mhm,
but any type of a loss is rated in our life, and that's why the more losses you have in a succinctful way, it becomes more and more difficult to cope with life. And of
mhm,
course, then when you factor in a wrong way of coping, different kind of coping mechanisms, and so
mhm,
when you cope in a wrong way, then all that does is make it more difficult in the grieving process.
mhm, mhm. So, one of the things that I was thinking about in particular here was a friend of mine who, by choice, moved from one city to another in a different area of the country. And after she got there, she'd made the choice to do this, and she couldn't understand why suddenly she was feeling depressed and sad so much of the time. So, and I told her I felt like she was going through grief over loss, and she said, "Oh no, it can't be. I chose this." So, was I right or was she right?
No, I think you're spot on. When you've lived like in a certain place for a certain amount of time and developed friendships, you
Mhm,
developed a way of life, and then you leave that abruptly, and then relocate. There's a grief there. There's a loss there. Uh, if you
mhm,
lose your job, that's a grief. And so again, we don't even realize how so many times we're facing, experiencing all these losses. And
mhm,
what we've learned, of course, in grief share is that if you don't address each one of them individually, then they kind of become embedded in us. And then all of a sudden, we have something fresh and real, and we can't
mhm,
deal with it. And we realize that there are 3 or 4 different losses that we never ever quite got through. And
mhm,
so that's why it's really, really important that each time we recognize that there's been a loss in our life, that we address it and deal with it
mhm,
and work through
mhm,
that.
mhm. And it might just be some things are obvious, the loss of a loved one, the loss of a pet, the loss of a job, but sometimes it's just the loss of the familiar that is so unsettling and makes us feel so lost, really. Even if we chose that, we chose the change that went along with that. And it's so easy to tell ourselves, oh, I shouldn't be upset about this. I shouldn't be grieving. I don't have anything to be depressed about. And then we just heap more guilt on ourselves and make
There's a
it so much harder to work through the grief.
there's a term we use, especially in hospice care. We call it anticipatory grief, which means we are
Mm,
anticipating the loss. Of course, in our case, it's the loss of that individual. But when you lose them, you don't just lose the person, you lose all the things that's connected with that person, which is
ooh,
all the dreams and aspirations of spending time with them, um,
mhm,
the opportunities of the relationships, the
mhm,
high marks that you would experience with that person if they had lived. And so there's so much more in that grief
mhm.
process that we go through and experience.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, Steve, because I know a lot of women who have lost babies in the womb, and they feel so isolated, so alone. They're grieving deeply over the loss of that child that they never even got to see or hold in their arms. And the people around them can't understand it. It doesn't look like much of a loss to them because they're like, well, it's not like they were ever here, but that child was here for that mother. And she had already been dreaming about what that child's life would be like, what her life would be like with that child, anticipating getting to, see the first steps and the first tooth and find out what they thought was funny and what their, um, inclinations were. And then someday watching them graduate or get married, or she's already been thinking of all those things. And when the baby is gone, there's a loss of all of that, and it affects her very, very deeply. So I'm glad you mentioned that as being, one of the ways that we grieve is that anticipatory grief. And I'd never heard that term before, so thank you for giving that to us. Um, so I want to go back a little bit, and you mentioned grief share a couple of times, and I'm so grateful because I really want to spend a lot of time talking about grief share and how you got into that and why that is so important and so helpful.
Well, so I started when I started chaplaincy with the, the hospice group I was with. I began immediately to have a grief support group. And a lot
Mhm,
of it was just learning on the fly, not really sure exactly what I'm doing. And so I had various places that I would have it, and I would take different themes every month, and I would do it once a month, and
mhm,
always trying to involve meals with that because people respond better when they're fed, I believe. And so
mhm,
I did that probably for the first 10 years, maybe a little bit more of my ministry. And so in 2000, well, I got remarried in 2011. And so in 2013, my wife has a cousin in South Florida. And so we visited her, and she invited me to be a guest or to sit in on her grief share. That's the first time I'd ever heard of that. And the
mhm,
moment I sat in on that, I began to realize this is something special. This is not like anything that
mhm,
I have ever experienced before and dealt with. And so immediately, when I came back home, I tried to get it a part of my hospice group, and then I found out that it's connected only with local churches. So your local church has to pay a fee there, and then they're able to purchase all the books and the tapes and those things which are part of it. And so eventually I got
mhm,
my pastor aboard. And so somewhere around 2016, We did it on a Wednesday night, and there are 13 sessions. And the way it was set up is that every week there's a session. And when you do that at church on a weekly basis, it works out. But then I wanted to incorporate it with the families of my hospice patients. And so at the same time, I did that once a month. And we did that for, if you do that in a correct way, it takes about a year to go through all the sessions there. And so the second time I went through it, I realized that they were not at a right place where the information was really pertinent for them. So then I
Mhm.
asked them, can we go twice a month? And so from that point on, that's what we've been doing, it twice a month. And for me, it's the first and third uh, Thursday of every month. We meet at 11
Mhm.
o'clock, and I always feed my folk that come, and we just have a good time of connecting and making
Mhm.
friendships, and then we get right into the video series there.
Mhm. I love that you do that at 11 o'clock because that means even people who are working can leave and take lunch and come and do this and then go back to work.
And that's one of the reasons
So
why I did that, is that a lot of our family members were older, and they didn't drive at night, and so and
mhm,
everybody has a lunchtime, and so I deliberately did that from 11 to 1, and we have a 30-minute meal, and then we get right into our video series, and then if people have
mhm,
to, go back to work or whatever, they can slip out.
mhm, mhm. I love that. So, Steve, what is so special about Grief Share? What makes it stand out?
Well, for me, the fact that it's Christ-centered, and the beauty of it, especially in the video session of it, you have what I call valuable insights from pastors, counselors, Christian counselors, those who have gone through and walked through grief and their personal stories.
Mhm,
And so many times in the traditional grief support, you kind of sit in a circle and go around the circle and ask each person to share. And not only can it be intimidating, but you're really not
mhm,
sure what you're sharing. And so
mhm,
with this, you're able to get those from all walks of life, different types of deaths, different types of relationships. And as they are sharing their story, then it speaks to you. It's like, yeah, that's what I'm going
mhm,
through. Yeah, that's what I'm feeling right now. And it helps you to be able then, as you get into the discussion time, to be able to verbalize the things that you've heard, and it makes it so much easier to share with each other. And then I tell people that the counseling, and not just counseling, but the biblical counseling that's given, you would pay hundreds
mhm,
and hundreds of dollars to go to that type of counseling, and yet you get that free with the video series. And so it's
mhm,
invaluable. And
mhm,
one of the things I have found that when people, if they dedicate themselves, I tell them, if you'll commit to 2 to 3 of these sessions, and if you feel like this is not for me, or I'm okay, that's fine. But truly believe if you'll do three as in succession as you can, then I think that you'll understand how important and valuable it is, and you'll be able to go through the whole series. And then, like you, I think you went through almost the second half of the second time through. And many of mine, once they went through it, because they're at different season of their grief journey.
mhm,
And so we always tell them that the first year is the most difficult time, because you're dealing with all of your anniversaries, you're dealing with birthdays, you're dealing with holidays.
mhm,
And so that's why it's really good to go ahead and get a second session in as you're at a different stage of your grief.
mhm. Yeah, that's so true. I remember when I first came into it, and I can remember why I was a little resistant because I didn't understand what it was, and I did think I was gonna come in, it'd be a group of people sitting around, and we were all just gonna pour out our grief, and I remember feeling like I am just on the edge right here of barely being able to hold it together, and if I start talking about it, the floodgates are gonna open, and I wasn't sure I would ever be able to stop the flow after that, and I mean, like, ever. I was afraid I would literally have a nervous breakdown right there and would not be fit for anything after. And I came to Grief Share, shortly after my mother passed away. But I soon realized after I was in Grief Share for just a few weeks that, I was not grieving my mother nearly as much as I was grieving my marriage that had ended about 6 months before my mother died. And when I came to realize that, I felt guilty because I felt like my mom deserved better from me.
Right,
She
right.
deserved me to grieve over her and felt like, "What is wrong with me that I'm not doing that?" So, but going through Grief Share helped me understand what was happening to me. And so that's one thing I want you to talk about a little bit. Well, tell us first, what does grief even look like? I know it's different for different people, but what are some of the things that we might all see in common? And then tell me how some of it can be different for different people.
When I started doing a grief support, I went with some material by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and she came up with this what they call the 5 stages of grief. And it was really more for those who had the sentence of death in them, and they were realizing, again, anticipatory grief. And so there were 5 stages, and I kinda dealt with that, and it was always in succession of denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then eventually acceptance. But then when I went through this series, I began to realize that grief's not like that at all. Grief is all over the place. There is no standard for it, and there are a lot of different parts of grief that we don't quite understand, and so it's not uh, cut and dry. It's not easy to understand, and so many times, and a lot of it depends on the background that we came from, the type of relationship we had with that person. It deals with things that we have or have not dealt with in previous grief situations. It has to do with what part of the country we're in. The West Coast, out north, down in the South. Everybody grieves differently. And so I began to realize that grief is not just something that is in a book that's standard, but it's something that I personally am going through. And so I began to, you start dealing with the different areas. And that's what makes this series so good because it talks about your grief journey, about loneliness and sadness, about fearfulness, anger, regrets, of getting
Mhm.
stuck, and where you go through grief and 4 or 5 years down the road, you're still there. And so all this is something that you deal with in the grief process.
Mhm. Shaylee Jane is asking, is it true that when overwhelmed, our emotions and decisions are clouded? Did it happen to anyone else? And Shaylee, I can tell you that certainly happened to me. The first time that I know of that I went through grief was back in the 1980s when my 3-year-old son had passed away. And I remember afterwards, I had never lost anyone close to me before, not even grandparents. I still had 3 of my 4 grandparents. One had passed away when I was younger, and I didn't have the opportunity to get to know him that well, but the others I knew very well, and I still had all of them. And I had not lost anyone, so I did not know what to expect. I still had 2 small children at home after he passed away, and, um, and I remember feeling like Yeah, I was sad. Every time I stepped in the shower, I cried, and I
Mm.
cried the whole time I was in the shower, and then when I turn off the water, it was like the tears stopped, and I didn't understand that. I didn't plan to cry. It wasn't like I felt sad or anything. It just seemed to happen. But then, once I was out and, going about my day, like I said, I had these 2 small children to take care of, and I felt like I have to be focused, to be able to take care of them adequately, and they've just lost their brother, and other things have happened to them that were upsetting. Before he passed away, sometimes they'd wake up in the morning and their brother and I would be gone. 'Cause I'd had to take him to the hospital during the night, and the neighbors were there, or my mom was there with them, which was unsettling for them. So I realized they were going through some things too. I was trying to stay focused on them, but I had to come smack face to face with the fact that there were periods of time where I didn't know what I was doing or what I had done. I would drive to church, and after I got there, I'd suddenly realize I don't know what route I took to get here. I don't remember the trip at all. How did I even get here? There were other times I still remember this one. It was so embarrassing. I pulled up to a four-way stop and then I waited for the light to change. And the car behind me honked its horn. And I said, "In a minute, buddy, when oh, there is no light." There was another time where I stopped at a traffic light and waited for the light to change. And then when it did change, I started to go, only to realize, wait a minute, the light is red. It just changed to red. I watched it change, which meant I had stopped at a green light and been
Mm.
waiting for the light to change the whole time. That's I didn't recognize what was going on. I didn't know that was grief because I thought grief had to do with sadness, and I wasn't feeling that sadness. But I had such an inability to concentrate and focus and even remember that it greatly interfered with my life. And I didn't even know back then. And I don't know, was there such a thing as grief share back in the 1980s?
No, really, there wasn't. I mean, we had grief
Yeah.
support, but it wasn't as concentrated. But one of
Mhm.
the things we have to understand that grief affects us holistic, and the Bible
Mm.
teaches us that we're created body, soul, and spirit, and so we grieve physically. And you shared some of the physical symptoms that you were going through, and physically it affects us, especially at the
Mhm.
beginning of our grief process. But then it affects our soul, which is our mind, our will, and our emotions. And so
Mhm.
it clouds our thoughts, our decision making process. We're consumed with it. The will to make decisions and choices, we struggle with that. And then again, our emotions. One minute we're sad, one minute we're angry, one minute we're in despair. And so our emotions are all over the place. And then in our spirit, how we relate even to God and to other people, it affects our relationships. So all of that is involved in the grief process. And we didn't ask for this. This is what happens to us when we go through grief. And that's why we have to have a plan to get through that process. As one counselor said, you're going to hurt for a long, long time and you'll never forget it, but it won't be as difficult and as painful
Mhm.
in the days ahead. And so that's why you have to deal with each grief situation uniquely and individually.
Mhm. Steve, what if you don't? What if you don't? What if, something happens that is so terrible or overwhelming or just causes you so much pain that you just don't wanna go there, you just wanna move away from it and act like it didn't happen or, um, just ignore it as much as you can. What happens then?
Well, when you go into that denial, and I think all of us, Nina, we all have different ways of denying things. Uh, Here's another statement that they give in this um, these seminars is that the 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 heart doesn't accept what the head already knows, or the heart takes longer to accept what the head already knows. And so when we begin to ignore whatever grief we're going through, our head knows it. We understand it. We acknowledge it, but our heart just can't embrace it. And so we just kind of stick it inside. We tuck it inside, and then we just go on and live life. And what is again, one of the counselors said is that one day there's going to be a resurrection of our emotions, but the problem is
Mm.
that we're not going to be in control of them. It's just going to come out,
Whoa.
and we would say, "Whoa, what happened there?" And a lot of that is the emotions that we have kept inside of us that we didn't deal with.
Mhm.
And so that's why it's so important that you address all these different areas of the grief process.
Mhm.
Not necessarily that I have anger. I'm just an angry person. No, but there probably is some area of anger that you just haven't dealt with. So as it comes into your life, then at that moment, address it, deal with it, as again, lean into it and accept it. And then in a Christ-like way, try to get God's help and strength, and have accountability, friendships that can help you walk through that grief process.
Mhm. You know, wow, that just kinda hit me between the eyes when you said that about whatever you haven't dealt with, whatever you just kinda shoved down, all those feelings will resurrect, and then you won't be able to control them. And that's exactly what happened to me just about a year after my son passed away. You know, I told you I'd been crying in the shower every day. That probably ended maybe after, I don't know, 4 or 5 months, something like that. And I was so busy taking care of my other children and meeting their needs and being a single mom, that I just didn't have time to analyze things or lean into that grief, so I thought. But about a year after my son passed away, uh, one day, out of the blue, it just seemed to hit me in a way it never had before, all the things that he had suffered before he died.
Mm,
And even though I knew them all before, I knew them up here, but I hadn't let myself feel them in my heart. And suddenly I did. And when I did, I started weeping.
mm,
And I literally cried nonstop for a whole week. And even while I was crying, I was thinking, "I don't get it. Why am I crying now? It's over. He's not going through those things now. Why am I?" You know, but it was because I had stuffed those down and I couldn't deal with them before. Yeah, you're right, EU. It's an upset in the house when that happens. I was worried about whether my kids would think mom is losing it and what's going to happen to us, because I knew that was one of their concerns too. So, but thankfully, it only lasted the week. And that's not to say I didn't have other occasions in the years after that. But again, I never knew when that was going to happen or come up. Sometimes people would bring up my son, and I could talk about him and not be emotional. The other people would be emotional, but I was not. But then there were other occasions where someone else would start talking about him, and I'd immediately tear up and start crying, and they'd be like, "Oh, I'm so sorry if I hurt you," and I think, "No, no, it's you haven't hurt me. I'm actually glad to hear you talking about him. I'm glad to hear the mention of his name, but because it means something to me. I can't seem to hold the tears back. I can't
mm,
seem to keep from crying now." So, yeah, I was just looking at some of the comments we're having here. There's a lot of other people who've been going through similar things too. So, Steve, one of the things I remember as I was going through Grief Share, it was so helpful to me because um, it let me know that a lot of the things that I was feeling or thinking or experiencing that I had no idea was part of grief, that it really was part of grief. So that helped me know, for one thing, that I wasn't losing my mind because I thought I was up until then. But it also helped me hear that there were some things that maybe in shame I had tried to stuff down. One of those being, for instance, anger or guilt. Can you talk to me about those a little bit?
Well, again, anger and guilt are emotions, and God gives us emotions. But one of the things that we understand is that there's righteous anger, and there is anger of the flesh, and we all have guilt. But is it the right kind of guilt? Because
Mhm,
healthy guilt produces something productive, and then once it has been finished, then that guilt should go away. So that means that there's something underlying, something deeper that we haven't dealt with. And that's why, and same thing with anger. All of us get angry, but Jesus said that to be angry and sin not. So is it possible that we
mhm,
can be angry, but still not be manifested in sin? And so that's where you have to do the work of grief in finding what is the root cause of my anger? What is the root cause of me being anxious? Or why is it that I keep going back to having these feelings that I should have done something different or better, or I
mm,
didn't do
mhm,
what I should have done? And so it goes back to forgiveness is a big area that we have to deal with, in that you have to get forgiveness from the Lord if it's something that you have done, and we know that the Lord is faithful and just to forgive us of all of our sins. And then we have to, if possible, to get forgiveness from other people. And this is difficult if that person is already gone on, and we can't talk to them. And so that's, in situations like that, we still have to pardon them. And that's critical because that's more for us than them.
mhm,
And
mhm,
so we have to deliberately forgive. And if we don't, the Bible says that we resist the grace of God, and a root of bitterness
mhm.
uh, will affect us and spring up and affect all of our other relationships. And this is one of the things that I see in my counseling with hospice. There's a lot of individuals late in life, and they have relationships with their children, adult children even, and they're not speaking to one another. Their issues have never been dealt with, and
Mhm,
so they can't have peace before they go on. And so it's just critical that we forgive those. And then the last part of forgiveness is forgiving yourself, and that's hard to do,
mhm,
Nina, where whether it was deliberate or it just happened, is you forgive yourself, you pardon yourself. As Christ has forgiven you, you forgive yourself. And so those two kind of go hand in hand, this anger and guilt. They're
mhm,
different, but they're similar in the way that they work in our life.
mhm. And you're right, one can sometimes be the catalyst for the other. I've talked to people before who women who've lost a spouse, their husband died, and then they felt angry at their husband for leaving them alone. And
Right.
even though their head said is irrational, their heart was still angry and
Mhm.
hurt over this. But they felt like they couldn't tell anybody because they were so ashamed to feel angry at the person who died.
Right.
It just seemed so wrong. So they were just holding it in and didn't know what to do with it. And I think if they had been able to go through grief share, they could have worked through a lot of that and recognized it's entirely human and maybe even normal for me to feel this way. But God is able to help me through this, even if it's God I'm angry at, because He's big enough for that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that is so helpful to hear that. So, but I also remember some very, very practical things as I was going through grief share that that I remember thinking, "Oh man, this was not on my radar. I didn't even think about this. I'm so glad to hear what others did because I wouldn't have known." One of those is what to do with the things that the person we've lost has left behind. So, can you talk to me about that a little bit? What does grief share teach about that?
Again, everybody is different and individualistic about how you deal with the belongings of that person. And again, depending on your personality and your background, some people want to immediately um, dispose of everything, and
That was
so
my dad when my mom
uh,
passed away. Yeah.
the old saying, "Out of sight, out of mind." And so you have those who immediately they want to clean the room out, they want to get all the clothes taken out of the closet, anything that identifies with that person, because it is painful. And that's why a lot of times we tell uh, our survivors not to make major decisions in that first year, because you need to do some make memories of the things that you had with that person. And many times they put pressure, family members, friends put pressure on you to, let's quickly get this thing taken care of, and we want you back the way you were. We want it the way
Mm,
it was before, and it doesn't happen that way. And so then you have those that kind of make it like a memorial, and they don't want
mm,
to get rid of things. And so they hold on for years and years and make it almost like a shrine. And so, part of the counsel that's given is you kind of decide on what's really important to you and to family, and allow them to take those mementos, and then take the other items and either donate them, give them to those who need them, or sometimes you can take something and make a scrapbook out of personal items. There's a lot of different ways that you can uh, remember that person and still have them special to you as you're going through life. And so again, a lot of it depends on what is comfortable to you personally,
mhm,
and because you're the one that's going through grief. And if it's your children or your other siblings, they're dealing with grief on their own level too. But you
mhm,
have to kind of know what is best for you, and not feel intimidated to take baby steps. Uh, Again, one of the counselors made this statement that maybe one day you walk close to the closet, and then the next day you turn the light on in the closet, and the next day you walk
mhm,
into the room of the closet and you just kind of go through the clothes and look at them, and then later on you kind of decide on what you need to do with those clothes. But there's a pattern there, and it's not where you feel like I have to immediately dispose of everything. And so
mhm,
I think just
mhm,
again, you need spiritual discernment and what's best for you.
mhm. Yeah, I think that's true. And I think one of the things I loved about that the most was the incremental approach to those things that seem so hard and so intimidating to do, like cleaning out a loved one's closet when you don't want your house to reflect that this person isn't there anymore, because you don't want them to not be there anymore, and you wanna still see those things around you and so forth, and yet this is necessary. I really need to do this, but I don't want to, and I don't know how I can. I don't know how I'll get through this. So to be able to do it incrementally, like you said, just going to the door of the room and just touching the doorknob, maybe that's all you can do
Mm,
on the first few days, and then maybe the next time you can open the door, maybe not swing it open all the way, but just um, an inch open, And it's very, very incremental, but it allows you time to process it and to get there on your own. So, Steve, what happens though if what you need, what you feel like you need, and what a family member feels like they need are opposed to each other? You feel like I need it to be out of sight, out of mind. The family member says I need to be able to see it every day and to not feel like the world is going on without my loved one as if nothing ever happened.
Well, each person has to be in agreement, I think, of what the needs are and not place your needs above their needs. And that's where there's a healthy communication. And I think that's where you need to express to one another, this is how I'm feeling right now. And I realize that, this is difficult for you and you would rather me go ahead and get all this out so that we don't have to deal with this anymore. But I need this time to process this. I need this time to uh, to get closure in my life. And so
Mhm,
I think it's important that we appreciate what people want for us, but at the same time, I think we need to be willing to stand our ground and do it in a Christ-like way and let them know, this is what I'm gonna do, and I hope you understand that and realize that I'm not being inconsiderate of your feelings, but you have to also understand what I'm going through, what I'm feeling, what I'm experiencing. And so, the Bible talks about speaking truth, but doing it in the context of love. And so
mhm,
when you care for people, you let them know how you feel. That's being real, that's being genuine. But at the same
mhm,
time, you do it with love. And so it's just important that, and sometimes, we have to be willing to get out of our comfort zone. Um,
mhm,
and the Bible says that there is safety in a multitude of counselors. And so, you know, again, I'm the one that's going through this, and so I'm having to go through this journey of grief myself. But at the same time, there are other people, whether it's family, whether it's friendships, and there's going to be some difficulties there because uh, it's not going to be the same, and it's a new, and so it may be that in this new period that I'm gonna have to, especially if it's a mate, and I'm gonna have to now redesign that whole house and make it for me, and it's okay, well, the kids don't understand that, and so, but this is what is best for me, and you need to understand that and accept that. I
mhm,
still love you, but this is what I need in my life.
mhm, mhm. You know, one of the things I remember hearing from others as I was going through grief share about what they did with the things of their loved ones was that they took some of those things and repurposed them
Right.
in another way so they could still have them there when their eyes saw it. It still reminded them of that loved one. And yet it wasn't, this memorial shrine either. It had become something beautiful. Uh, one of those in particular, our good friend Jan, um, her husband had passed away, and I had the opportunity. She invited me into her home, and I got to see how she had taken, bit by bit, she had gotten rid of his things, but it took her a long time to do it because she just couldn't bear to part with him. And the one thing in particular she couldn't bear to let go of was his neckties. He had had lots of different neckties, and he enjoyed wearing them. He enjoyed each one, and she just couldn't part with them. She ended up making or having somebody make. They put them together, all the neckties, so they literally made this circle and out of the neckties. It was the most beautiful thing, like a sunburst almost. And then she got herself like a quilt rack to display it on in her house. And it is a conversation piece. People walk in, it is so gorgeous. That's the first thing they comment on. And then Jan has the opportunity, if she wants to talk about her husband. And in that way, in a way to kind of keep his memory alive. And I think that is really ministering to her.
Well,
So,
when we lose someone, our life still goes on, and so we don't move on, but we move forward and we bring them with us. And
yeah.
so those things that you're mentioning, that's part of who they are. And so wherever we go in life, we're still bringing them with us, their memories of them.
Mhm,
And so that's just one of the ways that we can remember them by. It's part of their legacy that we're bringing and
mhm.
carrying with us.
I think that is the most purposeful and best thing you could have said right there, is that we don't move on, we're moving forward and we're bringing them with us. That's so helpful and so important.
Mm.
Steve, I am so sorry to say we're actually out of time and we have
Yeah,
to close the show right now, but it's been a great discussion. Would you be willing to come back sometime and talk with us
absolutely.
again? There's so much more we could say. Excuse me. Y'all, I want to thank you for joining us today on the This Way Network for the chat session. Our guest has been Steve Spray, who is a hospice chaplain and a grief share facilitator. And thankfully, he'll be coming back. Yes, I agree with you, Lucas. Two favorite words: moving forward. Great thing. So, thank you everybody for being here, and hopefully, we'll see you next week. And we'll see Steve another time. Steve, thank you for joining us.
Thank
Y'all
you.
be of good courage because God is with us and we are not alone.
Mm.
Bye, everybody.